from the beginning, we have been advised to stay in our lane. And from the beginning of COVID, from the beginning of us talking on DarkHorse about things that appear to be outside of what we have thought about before. I remember early on when there was the first inklings that there might be a vaccine on the horizon, when the public was first hearing about it, and the word adjuvant was new, at least to me, and we talked about it on air. And some of the comments that came back were, who are these people? If they don't even know what an adjuvant is, how dare they talk about vaccines? And this was obvious from the beginning as a way to shut down discourse. We have been, I find, three episodes in which we focus on even naming the episode some version of here's why you don't stay in your lane, on this kind of critique, which is narrow-minded, assumes that expertise is both perfect and static, and is a kind of gatekeeping which serves mostly to preserve the autonomy and unquestioning authority of those currently in power, as opposed to those who don't have it. And I don't see that in the persona in general of Geert Vanden Bossche, never having spoken to him myself, but it is a state to which many people with some legitimate expertise like to return. And, I think we've seen this over and over and over again during not just COVID, but with the woke stuff that has been invoked, of course, that, you're told, we are told, okay, there's a specific expertise that you must have in order to speak on this, and if you don't have that, then you can't speak on this. Well, that's the kind of reductionist thinking that has gotten us into the absolute mess that we have gotten into. But then you also have the more transparently insane, if you are not Black, you can't speak to the Black experience, for instance, right? If you are not Latina, you can't write a book in which a Latina shows up as a character, which is obviously, the end of literature, the end of fiction, the end of story, the end of, so much of what makes us human. But over in what you might think is more important territory, although I'm not sure that story isn't just as important, you obviously can't do science this way either. You simply cannot. And we've talked about this over and over and over again. And to your point that you made several minutes ago, we have said this many times, and I'm always a little bit hesitant about it because it seems like we then are creating a pedestal on which we stand and say, but because of the particular field in which we are trained and in which we have educated ourselves, we have an ability to have a window on all of these things. But it's true. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Was that Dobzhansky, I think?
Yep.
So this is, one of the great 20th century evolutionary biologists, one of the framers of the modern synthesis in the 1930s, 1940s. And it's just true. And yet it's also true that most biologists, and in biology, I include all of the things. I don't include chemists inherently or physicists, but I certainly include vaccinologists and virologists and public health people and ecologists and molecular biologists and all of these things, because they're working within the sphere of biology, ought to imagine themselves as biologists and therefore understand deeply something about evolution, and yet most people do not. And there are many aspects of evolutionary change, and we have fluency in many of those different both scales and dimensions, the microevolutionary scales at small time frames and the macroevolutionary scales at larger time frames, both the neontology and the paleontology. And and we don't expect other people walking in to questions that have an evolutionary framing to understand all of those things. But if you are speaking about anything that is biological, you are inherently speaking about something that is evolutionary. Therefore, you ought to know something about what the evolutionary framing is, and you have no grounds on which to shut down an evolutionary biologist who has come in and said, I'm going to take a look at what it is that you're saying and what your claims are and see if it holds up. And we're going to be wrong sometimes, and you're going to be wrong sometimes. And the goal is that we all do the investigations that we're doing in good faith and admit when we're wrong, learn from those mistakes, and do not hold each other to insane standards that will only restrict human knowledge and flourishing.
Beautifully said. I am reminded of the ecological distinction between territory and home range. Because effectively what we're saying is in inquiry, especially in science, there can be no territory. You can have a home range. You can have a set of topics that are the place that you spend your analytical time. But the idea of saying, actually, well, then you don't spend your time there to somebody who comes in with a different toolkit, no, that is absolutely illegitimate. It is the product of an economic environment of limited resources in which people wish to exclude others, not because it causes the science to be purer, but because it basically removes a set of challenges that are difficult to field.
So the ecological terms that you have just invoked perhaps need defining. We have talked about them recently on DarkHorse, but a home range, just in ecology, strictly speaking, literally, a home range is all of the space that you ever go to. So for terrestrial organisms, it's every piece of real estate that you ever visit, the entire landscape over which you roam. Whereas so every organism has a home range. Every organism has some space which they have been to, and that can be considered their home range. Some organisms, but not all, also have territories, and we refer to those organisms as being territorial. Territory is always going to be smaller than home range, and territory is a subset of the space in which you travel, which you defend against intruders. You may not defend against all intruders. You may defend it in ways that don't look like defense to those on the outside. It may be intrinsic defense. It may be time-delayed, non-synchronous defense. There's a lot of ways to defend a territory. Maybe chemical defense, but if you are defending some piece of the landscape against others, then that space that you are trying to defend is your territory or your hoped for territory. And your point here is that in science, we are trained in particular kinds of questions, and those are the questions about which we will be most native. And we will have the greatest understanding both of the types of methods that are used, and because just as you prefer to have a surgeon who is not brand new and also not so old that he can't hold the scalpel, you want someone with a lot of experience but still has the chops. You want someone when you are going into a question and trying to figure out what is true, perhaps you will have better luck at getting a good answer from someone who has run into several questions like that before. On the other hand, with the failures of modern science and the reductionism of modern science, which does tell you to stay in your lane and does tell you to specialize and that you shouldn't ask questions over here because they aren't going to get you more publications, which means you aren't going to get tenure, the specialists are becoming less and less reliable with regard to the very questions on which they are being asked to describe reality. And so we actually may come to expect that the specialists know less. And what we would hope for is that more and more people say, you know what? I'm actually a scientist. I can think scientifically, and so should we all. And therefore, I'm going to walk into this space and say, what do I know? What do I not know? What can I infer? How would I know that I was wrong? What kind of evidence would demonstrate that I'm wrong? What would be confirmatory evidence? But what I'm really looking for is falsifying evidence, and only then, really. And what do the other people who think they know what they're talking about in this space think is going on? That shouldn't come first, and it certainly shouldn't be the only thing that you rely on.
So I wanted to just add, lots of animals do have a home range, some place that they exploit, and they don't defend any part of it. So my argument would be, in science, there is no place for defending a territory. Anybody is welcome to investigate any question with whatever toolkit they bring to bear, and some toolkits will be less effective over here, some not at all. But you can't exclude somebody from your question because it's your question. You don't have that kind of ownership. Now, your analysis makes me wonder, actually, if there isn't a principle here that actually a generalists are probably more immune to corruption than specialists. What happens in an era where you have high degrees of specialization is that, you know, the lies that your discipline tells in order to cause the grant money to flow become sacred. You can't afford to have people challenging the wisdom of vaccinating within vaccinology. So you will effectively have a kind of religion of vaccinology in which it is taken as a given that there are lots of places that we can simply make you healthier by upgrading your immune system.
If your entire career is based on this one thing, you are likely to stay in your lane, stay the course, become canalized. And which means that at the point that it becomes clear, which it will for some people, because this is just the way of discovering reality. Oh, actually, that course you've been on for your entire career turns out to have been misguided. It's much harder to say, oh, that sucks, and I guess I'll go look over here now. If it's the only thing you know how to do, you really don't have the option.
In fact, it's strangely analogous to original antigenic sin, which is one of the concerns about vaccines, which is that if you show the immune system a version of a pathogen, right, you have gone through the process of creating a vaccine, you inject somebody with it, the immune system leaps to the conclusion that this is the proper response rather than developing an organic response that is dynamic and basically attuned to the particular version you got. So original antigenic sin is one way in which vaccines can be counterproductive, and there's an intellectual equivalent of it, which is, you know, let's say that we've got 3 cases in which a vaccine is clearly the right way to address something. Let's take one that I think you and I would still agree is a valid vaccine, the rabies vaccine. I'm not saying that rabies vaccine isn't full of risks, but the point is rabies is a terrifying disease. This vaccine, as far as I know, does prevent you from getting it. And therefore, you know, a disease that you basically can't survive, but this vaccine prevents you from getting it. If you're likely to encounter rabies, it makes sense to be vaccinated. So that if you've seen that case and your point is, oh God, vaccines are lifesavers, right? And then you start applying it to, you know, COVID. And it's like, well, that disease is not very deadly and your vaccine technology is extremely radical. And what are the chances that it's going to be a net benefit for anybody?
You also redefined what vaccine means.
Right. You did it. Yeah. In order. I mean, it's almost the worst case of original antigenic sin is that now, you know, you see things that come with a needle as if they're vaccines rather than a gene therapy. But here's my real point to Garrett. And, you know, I still feel warmly toward Garrett, even though I take quite a bit of exception to the tone he takes with me here. And frankly, I don't like the tactical shit, right? The idea that what he wants to do is drive up my costs for speaking by claiming that I'm embarrassing myself. Well, look, you know, one of our strengths during the pandemic was admitting when we got stuff wrong, right? We did that lots because it was really easy to get stuff wrong, and you got stuff wrong too, Garrett. But being able to do that and becoming smarter because, you know, well, today I do know what transitation is, and I can now say something more nuanced about the wisdom of giving an intramuscular injection to create a mucosal immunity. And I know it's not 100%. I know that there is some degree of something you will call immunity that can leak over. Maybe it's even facilitated. But the point is, it's not the immunity you want when you're dealing with an evolving antagonist. You want an immunity that's capable of adapting. Am I saying there's no conceivable way that you could even get there from IgG leaking over into the lung? No, this is a complex system. I'm sure that I don't understand most of it, but can I take a pretty good guess as to whether or not the cost of X is going to exceed the benefit of it? Yeah, I'm doing all right on that front. So anyway, I think we've maybe wrestled one. I would at least want to put forward as a hypothesis that generalism creates an immunity to corruption because you are not so closely tied to the fate of your particular discipline. And this is the other question I wanted to raise about Garrett's point. I'm concerned that one of the reasons, maybe Garrett is angry at me because he thinks I refused to blurb his book, when probably if he even said that he wanted me to blurb the book, I just lost track of it, which is something I'm prone to. But I worry that there's another thing here, which is that Garrett is professionally a vaccinologist. I'm not saying that's all he is, but I am saying that that's one of the ways in which he identifies himself professionally. He has worked with Gavi. He has worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He has worked inside of pharma. Now, if that's your pedigree, right? If you've been schooled in a milieu where it is simply understood that we make the world a healthier place by bringing vaccines to it that are well targeted for the various pathogens that we encounter, then it's very hard to have what I think is a real epiphany that you and I have had, which we've talked about here. And I'm concerned that Garrett has seen it and that it's sacrilege, and that maybe we have a clip of it, me talking about we have 3 vaccine technologies and none of them are safe. There are 3 basic vaccine technologies, none of which are safe. The 3 technologies are live attenuated vaccines, not safe because individuals react differently. So you can actually, a attenuated virus that causes one person to have a tiny mild infection that does them no serious harm may cause another person to have a much more serious infection. And more importantly, it can evolve and it can spread. You're not supposed to have a contagious vaccine, but this can make a contagious vaccine. Witness, not necessarily about contagion, but the polio vaccine, live attenuated, has created many, many cases of polio. That's an intolerable downside for the vaccine. Second technology is the killed virus or virus fragments that get injected. And the problem with this is it doesn't convince the immune system that there's something to fight. And so the immune system doesn't mount a useful response unless it is triggered to do so by something called an adjuvant, which we've talked about many times. And adjuvants, the problem with them, as I discussed at the very beginning of the podcast here, is that they're non-specific. They just tell the immune system to freak out. And so the immune system will freak out, yes, at the antigen you've injected, but also to maybe the pollen that's blowing in the air that week, the stuff that is in your gut and possibly leaking out because of exposures to other things. So an adjuvant is a very dangerous technology because telling your immune system to freak out is not a safe thing to do. And then the final one is this new mRNA technology. And the mRNA technology is unsafe because it moves haphazardly around the body. It triggers cells wherever it happens to be taken up to produce an antigen. And the immune system is going to regard your own cells producing a foreign antigen as virally infected, and it's going to kill them, which is very bad for you if it happens in your heart. There may be other places in the body where it's not so serious, but the point is random or haphazard destruction of tissues around the body is not fundamentally safe. So edit that down to a paragraph. You've got 3 technologies. None of them are fundamentally safe. They all have their severe downsides. So I'm concerned that that's the state of my understanding right now. It could change, but the state of my understanding right now is that because each of the platforms on which you might build a vaccine are dangerous in their own right, that the case in which the disease is sufficiently dangerous and the vaccine is sufficiently safe to justify that those cases will be few and far between. And if you're a vaccinologist, the idea that a useful vaccine is something that we should expect very rarely is like agreeing that your sector of the market should be much tinier, right? In the same way that pharma more generally brings lots of drugs to market, and it takes us decades to find out what the harms are. But if you take a normal evolutionary approach to human health, you would suspect most of the drugs that people are on for chronic conditions are going to be unhealthy, and you've got to be pretty darn unhealthy to justify taking the risks, and therefore the more bang for the buck is almost always going to come in terms of making yourself healthier to begin with, so you don't have the pathology and don't need the drug. But, you know, from within pharma, I expect that to sound like crazy talk, right? I expect that because, you know, the point is it is agreeing that most of what we do is more harmful than benefit, and you probably wouldn't have gone into pharma if that's what you thought, right? So anyway, the generalist can see that. I wonder if specialists again and again are prone to falling into not only bad assumptions, but a self-serving worldview that is protected by people staying in their lanes.
I think that's exactly right. I think we see plenty of evidence of that.
Yep, I think so too.